The distress beacon from the Endless Prophet transmitted for 11 hours before anyone reached the coordinates. When salvage crews arrived, they found the vessel intact, engines functional, hull pressurized, navigation systems operational. Every technical parameter registered normal. The crew of 43 was gone. Not dead. Gone. The holds were empty of cargo but filled with structures that shouldn't exist. Frameworks of bone and wire. Altars built from deck plating and human remains. Chambers where the bulkheads had been reshaped into something between surgery and worship. The Rak'gol don't raid for plunder. They raid for material. This is the account from Vasily Korm, the Endless Prophet's junior navigator, who survived by remaining sealed in his sanctum while the rest of his ship was transformed around him. He transmitted his testimony to the Administratum before disappearing into the halo stars. The Inquisition classified the recording. It surfaced again 3 decades later in a data cache recovered from a derelict listening post. What follows is his story, in his words, supplemented by evidence extracted from the Endless Prophet's cogitator logs and the findings of the first salvage crew. How do you survive when your ship stops being a ship and becomes something the Imperium has no name for? We were 17 days into a standard transit from Footfall to Port Wander, when the Geller field started showing fluctuations. Minor variances. Nothing the engine seer considered worth aborting the jump. The Endless Prophet was a bulk hauler, 4 centuries old, equipped with reliable, if unspectacular, systems. Captain Morton ran a disciplined operation. We carried textiles, reclaimed metals, a modest quantity of obscura bound for port authorities who wouldn't ask questions. Routine cargo. Routine voyage. I was in the navigation sanctum when the first alarm sounded. Not the warp proximity warning. Not a drive malfunction. The hull breach klaxon, a sound I'd heard in drills but never in practice during my 8 years aboard. The VoxNet erupted with overlapping transmissions. Engineering reported decompression in the aft cargo sections. Security teams were deploying to seal the affected compartments. Captain Morton's voice cut through the chaos, ordering damage control and demanding a status report. Then the screaming started. Not panicked shouts, not calls for help. Screaming. The kind produced by biology pushed past tolerance thresholds, sounds that bypassed language and went straight to hindbrain recognition of another human in catastrophic distress. The VoxNet became unusable, every channel flooding with noise, some of it voices, some of it static that shouldn't exist in Vox transmission, some of it rhythmic patterns that resembled chanting or machinery, or both. I sealed the sanctum. Standard protocol when the ship is compromised and navigation is critical. The chamber was shielded, self-contained, provisioned for a week of isolation if necessary. I could monitor ship systems through the cogitator interface, but couldn't access visual feeds from the corridors. The schematics showed me what was happening in abstract. Red indicators spreading through the lower decks. Pressure changes in compartments that should have remained stable. Power fluctuations in sections nowhere near the reported breach. The cogitator logged the first border contact at 14:47 shipboard time. Security Team Alpha engaged hostiles in Cargo Bay 3. The log entry lasted 4 minutes before the team's vital signs flatlined simultaneously, not sequentially, as would occur in a firefight, but all at once, as if something had simply switched them off. Security Team Beta reached the bay 6 minutes later. Their vitals terminated 3 minutes after that. Captain Morton ordered all remaining security personnel to defensive positions at critical junctions and commanded the crew to evacuate non-essential sections. The ship's schematics continued updating. More red zones. more pressure anomalies. The boarding force was moving through the endless profit with clear purpose, not random violence. They were isolating sections, cutting off escape routes, herding the crew towards specific locations. I watched the crew vital signs on my cogitator screen, each one a name I knew, people I'd shared meals with, played regicide against, complained about duty rosters alongside, and watched them disappear one by one from the network. By hour 3, 70% of the crew was gone from the vital signs registry. The remainder had barricaded themselves in the bridge, the engine room, and a handful of reinforced storage compartments. I remained sealed in the sanctum, watching the abstract representation of my ship being systematically conquered by entities the cogitator couldn't classify. The targeting solutions that normally identified vessel classes and threat profiles simply displayed error codes when trying to process whatever had boarded us. The captain's final Vox transmission came at 19:23. His voice was controlled, professional, the tone of a man trained to maintain composure, even as circumstances dissolved into nightmare. He reported that the bridge was under siege, that the bulkhead seals were failing despite being rated for void exposure, that something was coming through the metal itself rather than through access points. He transmitted the ship's log to an emergency beacon with instructions to broadcast to any Imperial vessel in range. Then he said, "Throne have mercy on us," and the transmission ended. His vital signs remained active for another 47 minutes. I didn't know what had taken the ship. The cogitator databases contained fragmentary references to Xenos threats in the Coronis expanse, but nothing matched what I was observing. It wasn't until I accessed the emergency knowledge vaults, normally restricted to senior officers, that I found the entry. Rak'gol, a species the Imperium had encountered sporadically across the Halo stars for millennia, never in sufficient numbers to warrant Crusade-level response, always deadly enough to make each encounter a localized catastrophe. The entry was sparse, no anatomical details, no culture analysis, just tactical warnings. They board vessels rather than destroying them. They take captives. They modify captured ships according to unknown purpose. They cannot be negotiated with. They demonstrate technological sophistication despite appearing primitive in initial assessment. The file included a single picked capture from a derelict they'd previously raided. A cargo hold transformed into something the administratum scribe who logged the entry described as a cathedral of suffering, purpose unknown. I was locked in my sanctum aboard a ship they had already claimed. The vital signs counter had stopped updating. Either everyone else was dead, or the Rak'gol had damaged the monitoring systems enough that I could no longer track survivors. The cogitator showed power flowing to sections that should have been depressurized. Life support was active in areas where hull breaches had been confirmed. Someone, or something, was operating ship systems with enough technical knowledge to restore functionality after combat damage. The noises started around hour 6. Metallic impacts transmitted through the hull, regular and rhythmic. Cutting, welding, construction. The Rak'gol were modifying the endless profit, and I could hear them working through the deck plating. My sanctum was located in the ship's core, surrounded by essential systems and heavy shielding. They would have to cut through multiple bulkheads to reach me, which meant I was temporarily safe. Temporarily. I activated the sanctum's cogitator archive and began recording. If I was going to die aboard this ship, I would at least leave testimony that might help the next crew that encountered Rak'gol. The archive had sufficient capacity for weeks of recording, and the cogitator's power cell would outlast my provisions. I documented everything: the timeline of the attack, the sounds coming through the walls, the system readings that made no sense, the sections of the ship that were drawing power in patterns inconsistent with standard operations. The Rak'gol worked continuously. No rest cycles, no pauses, just endless hammering, cutting, welding, and other sounds I couldn't identify. Wet sounds, organic sounds, sounds that resembled neither machinery nor biology, but something between. I tried to map their activity based on power consumption and audio triangulation. They were concentrating their efforts in the cargo bays and the crew quarters. The bridge remained active, but showed unusual power signatures. Engineering was drawing more energy than should be possible given the ship's reactor output, which suggested they'd either damaged the monitoring systems or somehow increased generation capacity. On the second day, the VoxNet activated. Not with transmissions, with broadcast. A signal that cycled through every frequency, repeating the same pattern. A series of tones that might have been language or code, or simply noise, with no meaning except to Rak'gol receivers. I recorded it, ran it through linguistic analysis protocols, attempted to find structure. The cogitator identified rhythmic elements but couldn't parse semantic content. The broadcast continued for 3 hours, then stopped abruptly. 12 hours later, it resumed. Different pattern. Same structure. Repeating. Cycling. Broadcasting on all bands. This time, I detected something else beneath the primary signal. Faint audio that resembled screaming. Processed and distorted, but still recognizable as human vocal cords producing distress sounds. They were using the crew, not just killing them. Using them as components in whatever they were building. By the 4th day, I could track the Rak'gol modifications through system diagnostics. Cargo Bay 2 was drawing power in patterns consistent with medical equipment, surgical lasers, stasis fields, atmosphere processors set to non-standard mixtures. Cargo Bay 3 showed heat signatures, suggesting industrial forges operating at temperatures that should have melted the deck plating. The crew quarters were consuming massive amounts of water and exhibiting humidity levels that indicated either a coolant leak or deliberate environmental modification. I accessed the ship's internal sensors, the ones designed to monitor for fires and breaches. Most had been destroyed or disabled, but a handful in protected junctions remained functional. The feeds showed me fragments, a corridor where the walls had been covered with something organic, glistening and pulsing with irregular movement. A junction where cables had been ripped from conduits and rewoven into patterns that resembled nervous systems. A doorway sealed with what looked like bone, not human bone, too large and the wrong geometry, but definitely skeletal material, fused into the frame. The sensors couldn't capture the Rak'gol themselves. They moved too quickly, or the equipment couldn't process their forms, or they were deliberately avoiding areas with functional surveillance. I saw the results of their work, but never the workers. Just glimpses. A limb too long and jointed wrongly. A silhouette that suggested a humanoid shape but with proportions that violated bilateral symmetry. A shadow that moved against the direction of the light sources. The ship's mass was increasing. Subtle changes, but detectable through the navigation systems that constantly monitored our position and velocity. The endless profit was gaining mass, which meant the Rak'gol were adding material, either from their own vessels or by somehow generating it through processes I couldn't identify. The center of gravity was shifting toward the cargo sections, suggesting heavy construction in areas that had originally held only textiles and reclaimed metal. I calculated our trajectory. We were no longer drifting. Something was providing thrust, keeping us on course toward a destination that wasn't Port Wander. The main drives were offline, according to diagnostics, but we were definitely accelerating. The Rak'gol had either repaired systems I couldn't monitor or installed their own propulsion. We were traveling deeper into the expanse, away from established shipping lanes, toward coordinates that didn't correspond to any charted world or station in the navigation database. The Vox broadcasts became more complex, multiple signals overlapping, some of them clearly using the ship's communication array, but others emanating from sources I couldn't locate. I recorded everything, attempting to build a database that might help decode their purpose. One transmission included what sounded like Imperial High Gothic, severely distorted, but recognizable. Words from the Litany of Protection, phrases from the Blessing of the Machine, fragments of prayers that every void ship crew knew by heart. They were using the crew's own words, repurposed into their broadcasts, meaning they had captured and interrogated or observed enough to identify language patterns. Then the tapping started, not on the sanctum door, on the walls. Rhythmic, deliberate, moving around the chamber's perimeter. Something was testing the shielding, looking for weak points, measuring the space. I checked the structural integrity monitors. No breaches, no pressure changes. But something was definitely outside, circling, probing. The tapping continued for hours, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. Sometimes in patterns that corresponded to the Vox broadcasts, as if whoever or whatever was making the sound was communicating with the broader Rak'gol force. I activated the Sanctum's emergency defenses, electromagnetic fields designed to disable servitors that might malfunction during warp transit. The tapping stopped. For 3 hours, silence. Then it resumed, faster, more insistent, accompanied by sounds that suggested cutting tools engaging the outer hull. I checked the power reserves. The defenses could operate for 6 days continuously. After that, I would have to choose between maintaining environmental systems or keeping the electromagnetic barrier active. On the 7th day, the Vox activated with a human voice. Not a recording, not a scream. A voice speaking Low Gothic with a footfall accent, calm and conversational, as if the speaker were reporting routine maintenance issues rather than addressing a navigator sealed in a sanctum aboard a captured ship. The voice belonged to Chief Engineer Parth, a woman I'd worked alongside for 5 years, someone I'd considered competent and unflappable even during plasma conduit failures. "Navigator Coram," she said. "You can come out now. The captain wants a course laid in." Didn't respond. I sat at my cogitator terminal, recording, and listened. "The modifications are complete. Your sanctum is integrated with the new configurations. The ship is ready for warp transit, but we need navigation coordinates verified against the updated mass distribution. You're required on the bridge." Her voice had the same rhythm it always had, the slight pause before technical terms, the way she emphasized action words, the precise diction learned from decades of filing reports with Mechanicus overseers. But there was something wrong underneath. The breathing between words was too regular, mechanically timed rather than biological. The pauses came in intervals exactly 2 seconds long, as if she were reading from a script rather than speaking spontaneously. "Navigator Coram, please respond. Your cooperation is noted in the manifest." I checked Parth's vital signs on my cogitator. Still flatlined. She had disappeared from the registry on the first day, in the initial wave of casualties, when the Rak'gol breached engineering. Whatever was speaking with her voice, it wasn't her. Not anymore. The transmission continued. "Refusal to comply will result in reclassification. Current designation, non-combatant specialist, retention value high. Potential designation, salvage material, retention value moderate. Confirm your preferred status." I forced myself to remain silent. Responding would confirm I was listening, would give them data about my reactions, would make me complicit in whatever psychological operation they were conducting. The sanctum was shielded against both physical and psychic intrusion. They couldn't know my status unless I told them. "We have a new course plotted," Parth's voice said. "Coordinates 77 Mark 23, warp depth Sigma. 3-week transit. The ship requires a navigator for the passage. You will perform this function." I accessed the coordinates through my cogitator. 77 Mark 23 was deep in the halo stars, far beyond Imperial charts, in a region marked only with warning sigils and notations about unreliable warp currents. No human settlement had ever been established there. No rogue trader had filed claims. It was empty space, the kind of void where ships vanished and never transmitted final reports. "You have 12 hours to signal compliance," the voice said. "After that, we begin deconstruction of the sanctum. The process will take 4 days. You will remain alive for the first 3. At the end, you will be integrated with the navigation systems as originally planned, but your conscious participation will not be required. Confirm your choice." The Vox went silent. I sat in my sanctum, surrounded by screens, showing the abstract representation of a ship I no longer recognized, and considered my options. I could remain sealed and hope that rescue arrived before the Rak'gol breached my defenses. The emergency beacon was still broadcasting, transmitting Captain Morton's final log and the ship's last known position. Any Imperial vessel in the region would eventually investigate. Eventually. Or I could believe that the Rak'gol were serious about their timeline, that they had the technical capability to cut through my shielding, and that whatever fate they had planned for me would be worse than immediate death. I opened a secure partition in the cogitator and began drafting my testimony. If I was going to be converted into whatever they were building, I would at least leave a record that explained how it happened. They started cutting 12 hours and 7 minutes after the deadline. The first indication was a temperature spike in the sanctum's outer hull. The Rak'gol were using plasma torches or something analogous, cutting through the reinforced ceramite in sections, removing pieces rather than attempting to breach directly through. The work was methodical, patient, precise. They weren't forcing entry. They were dismantling the chamber panel by panel, the way a tech priest might strip components from a malfunctioning servitor. I activated every defensive system the sanctum possessed: electromagnetic repulsion fields, localized void shield generators, emergency bulkhead reinforcements. Each one bought me minutes, not hours. The temperature continued rising. The cogitator reported stress fractures in the outer plating. The atmospheric processor struggled to compensate for the heat. I reduced life support to minimal levels, conserving power for the shields, and wrapped myself in a thermal blanket designed for emergency void exposure. The cutting stopped after 7 hours. I monitored the hull integrity. 30% of the outer shielding was gone, removed in neat rectangular sections that left the inner layers exposed, but not yet breached. Then came the sound of construction. They were attaching something to the exterior, welding or bonding new structures to the remaining hull. The cogitator couldn't determine what, only that mass was being added, and power signatures were appearing in configurations it couldn't classify. The second cutting phase began 18 hours later. Faster this time. They'd learned the shield patterns, adapted their tools, found the weak points in the sanctum's design. The temperature spiked beyond tolerance thresholds. I shut down non-essential systems, diverted all available power to the innermost shield layer, and accepted that I was going to lose consciousness from heat exposure before they finished breaching. I was wrong. They finished breaching first. The sanctum door didn't open. it dissolved. The metal simply lost cohesion and slumped into a liquid state, pooling on the deck while the frame remained intact. Beyond the opening stood something that might have been human once, but had been rebuilt according to principles I couldn't parse. It was approximately human-sized, bipedal, with appendages that served analogous functions to arms and legs, but proportions were wrong. Limbs too long, joints bending in directions that suggested multiple articulation points, a torso that seemed to contain more organs than human anatomy should allow. The surface was covered in something between skin and metal, dark and semi-reflective, interrupted by seams that glowed faintly with bioluminescent patterns. The head was worst, a roughly spherical mass atop the torso, featuring sensory organs I couldn't identify, clusters of lenses, apertures that opened and closed like gills, a structure that might have been a mouth if mouths were designed to open vertically instead of horizontally. No nose, no ears, just sensors and processing apparatus arranged in a configuration that made my navigator-trained perception recoil. It didn't speak. It gestured, a limb extended toward me, appendages spreading in a pattern that universal might mean come, or might mean something I had no context to understand. When I didn't move, it gestured again, more emphatically, and emitted a sound that combined mechanical clicking with organic vocalizations. I remained in my seat. I had nowhere to retreat. The sanctum's dimensions meant that whatever came through the doorway could reach me in 2 steps. My only weapon was a ceremonial blade used for ritual bloodletting during warp transit, useless against something that probably didn't have circulatory vulnerabilities. The Rak'gol reached forward, and I discovered that fighting back was a waste of effort. It didn't grapple or strike. It simply touched my shoulder, and my nervous system stopped accepting commands. Paralysis. Instant. Total. Leaving me conscious but unable to control voluntary muscle movement. I remained aware of my body, could feel sensation, could process information, but couldn't execute any physical response. The Rak'gol picked me up with surprising gentleness and carried me out of the sanctum into the corridor beyond. The endless prophet was gone, not destroyed, transformed. The corridor I'd walked countless times was now a passage through organic architecture. The walls weren't metal anymore. They were layered with something that resembled chitin or keratin, dark and ridged, growing in patterns that suggested intentional design. Conduits had been rerouted through translucent tubes that showed fluids flowing, some of them recognizable as coolant or lubricant, others biological, viscous, and moving with peristaltic contractions. Lighting came from bioluminescent patches embedded in the walls, glowing with sickly green and yellow hues that created shadows with unnatural depth. The air smelled wrong, metallic and organic simultaneously, like a surgery chamber and a forge occupying the same space. Temperature fluctuated as we moved, hot in some sections, cold in others, with no apparent correlation to ship systems. The Rak'gol carried me through junctions I recognized only by spatial relationship. Every familiar landmark was gone, replaced by structures that served unknown functions. A maintenance hatch had become an orifice sealed with membrane. A storage locker was now a chamber filled with crystalline growths that pulsed with internal light. The deck beneath us was no longer flat metal, but undulating, almost flexible, with textures that suggested it was grown rather than manufactured. We passed other Rak'gol. They moved through the transformed corridors with clear purpose, carrying materials or tending to construction that continued despite the ship being complete, according to Parth's hijacked voice. I counted 7 distinct variants, different sizes, different appendage configurations, different surface textures. Some were humanoid, others were quadrupedal or possessed so many limbs I couldn't determine the count. All of them ignored me, focused on their tasks with insectile single-mindedness. We reached Cargo Bay 2. The bay had been converted into something the administratum file called a cathedral, and I understood why the scribe chose that word. The space was vast, cathedral-sized, though the Endless Prophet's original cargo bay couldn't have been more than 40 meters across. The Rak'gol had somehow expanded it, cutting through multiple decks and bulkheads, creating a vertical chamber that rose through 3 levels of the ship. The walls were covered with structures that resembled altars, raised platforms connected by ramps and bridges, each one supporting apparatus I couldn't identify. Some held captured crew members, still alive, suspended in frameworks that combined restraint with life support. I recognized faces: Cargo Handler Pell, Medici Sarvin, Junior Officer Threx. All of them conscious, all of them motionless, all of them connected to machinery through interfaces that pierced skin and integrated directly with tissue. Other platforms held the dead, or what remained of them. Bodies had been disassembled and reorganized, components arranged in displays that suggested taxonomy or inventory rather than desecration. Organs were preserved in crystal chambers. Skeletons were articulated and mounted. Skin was stretched across frames, marked with notation I couldn't read. The Rak'gol had cataloged us, broken us down into constituent elements, and displayed the results like specimens in a xenobiologist's laboratory. The bay's center held the largest structure, a tower constructed from ship components and biological material, rising toward the ceiling in a spiral configuration. At the tower's base was machinery that resembled both a cogitator and a living organism. Metal and flesh merged seamlessly, cables growing into neural tissue, processors embedded in organs that contracted with rhythmic pulses. The Rak'gol carrying me approached one of the smaller platforms and placed me in a framework that adjusted to my dimensions. Restraints emerged from the structure, not mechanical clamps, but something warm and flexible that wrapped around limbs and torso with organic pressure. The paralysis faded gradually, leaving me with enough motor control to breathe and turn my head, but not enough to escape. Other Rak'gol gathered around the platform, examining me with sensor apparatus, taking measurements with tools that combined technological precision with biological adaptation. One of them held a device that resembled a surgical implement, multiple blades and probes extending from a central mechanism, each one moving independently, flexing like fingers or tentacles or something between. I forced myself to speak. "What are you doing?" The Rak'gol didn't respond. They continued their examination, scanning, measuring, cataloging. One of them made a sound that might have been communication, a series of clicks and whistles that carried complex, rhythmic information. The others responded with their own vocalizations, and I realized I was listening to a language, one with syntax and meaning, one that my human-trained perception couldn't begin to parse. The VoxNet activated. Parth's voice, calm and professional. Subject classified as navigator, tertiary grade, modified for warp sensitivity, suitable for integration, commencing extraction in 47 seconds. I didn't know what extraction meant. I discovered. The Rak'gol with the surgical tool approached, and the blades extended toward my face. I couldn't move, couldn't flinch, could only watch as the implement touched my skin just above my right eye. There was no pain. Whatever they'd used to paralyze me also blocked pain signals. But I felt pressure as the tool cut, felt the warm flow of blood, felt the sensation of tissue separating. They were removing my third eye, the warp-sensitive organ that made me a navigator, the mutation that the Imperium had trained and sanctioned and built an entire profession around, was being extracted with surgical precision. I watched, dissociated from my own body, as the Rak'gol worked. The tool moved with absolute confidence, cutting exactly where necessary, avoiding critical vessels, preserving the organ intact as it severed the connections. The extraction took 17 minutes. When finished, the Rak'gol held up the eye, still alive, still functional, trailing optic nerves and blood vessels. They placed it in a crystal container filled with fluid, where it floated and continued its subtle movements, responding to warp currents I could no longer perceive. My warp sight was gone. The universe suddenly felt flat, reduced to 3 dimensions, normal and wrong simultaneously. Another Rak'gol approached with a different tool, this one resembling a welder or cauterizer. They sealed the wound, not with sutures, but with something that bonded the tissue and left a scar that felt hot and tight across my forehead. Then they released the restraints, letting me collapse onto the platform, and stepped back, observing. I had enough motor control to curl into a fetal position. I did so, trembling, trying to process what had been done. They'd taken the one thing that made me valuable, the mutation that had defined my identity since adolescence, and turned it into a specimen in their cathedral. I was no longer a navigator. I was just Vasily Korm, former crew member of the Endless Prophet, captive aboard a ship that no longer existed as I'd known it. The Rak'gol made more sounds, communicating amongst themselves. One of them approached and injected something into my arm. Not gently, but not brutally either. The same clinical efficiency they'd shown throughout the extraction. Whatever the substance was, it dulled the horror enough that I could function. I sat up slowly, examining the cathedral around me, and understood what they'd built. This wasn't a trophy room. It wasn't torture. It was research. The Rak'gol were studying us, breaking us down into components, analyzing how human biology and Imperial technology integrated, cataloging capabilities and weaknesses. The crew members suspended in frameworks weren't being tormented. They were being preserved as specimens, kept alive so the Rak'gol could observe long-term responses to various conditions. The tower at the center was a database, storing information extracted from us. The altars were workstations where Rak'gol processed their findings. The entire cargo bay had been converted into a laboratory, and we were the experiment. They kept me in the cathedral for 3 days. During that time, I watched them work. The Rak'gol operated in shifts, though not on recognizable cycles. Some worked continuously for what seemed like 20 hours before being replaced. Others rotated every few hours. There was clear hierarchy. Some gave direction through vocalizations or gestures, while others performed technical tasks with specialized tools. The communication was constant, complex, never stopping long enough for me to identify individual words or concepts. They fed me, not human food, something they synthesized from ship stores, processed through machinery that extracted nutrients, and recombined them into a paste that tasted like nothing but kept me alive. They provided water. They even allowed me limited movement within the cathedral, though I was never permitted to leave or approach any of the other suspended crew members. I tried speaking to the other captives. Most were unconscious or unresponsive, kept in medically induced states that prevented awareness of their situation. A few were awake like me. Cargo handler Pell could move his eyes and appeared to recognize me when I approached, but couldn't speak. His vocal cords had been severed or paralyzed. Junior Officer Threx was awake and lucid, but refused to acknowledge my presence, staring at the ceiling with an expression of such complete dissociation that I wondered if he'd retreated into catatonia. Only Mediki Sarvin could communicate. She'd been suspended in a framework near one of the altars, her lower body connected to machinery that was slowly replacing her organs with Rak'gol equivalents. She spoke in whispers, barely audible, and what she said made me understand why Threx had chosen silence. "They're testing integration," she said, "seeing how human tissue responds to their biotechnology. I can feel it growing inside me. It doesn't hurt. That's the worst part. It should hurt, but they've done something to my nervous system that makes me feel only pressure, not pain. I can feel my liver being dissolved and replaced with something else, something that filters blood, but also processes nutrients they need. I'm being converted. Slowly. And I'm conscious for all of it." I asked if there was anything I could do. She laughed, a sound that came out wrong, distorted by whatever they'd done to her respiratory system. "You can remember," she said. "When they finish with you, when they turn you into whatever they're planning, remember that we were human once. Remember that we had names." She gave me a list, all 43 crew members of the Endless Prophet, recited from memory, each name pronounced carefully, despite her damaged vocal apparatus. I memorized them, repeating the list silently, burning it into my mind. It was the only act of resistance available, preserving identity in the face of systematic deconstruction. The Rak'gol called me back to the platform on the 4th day. This time the procedure was different. They didn't extract organs or take samples. Instead, they connected me to the tower, the central database structure, through interfaces that pierced my temples and the base of my skull. The connection was instant and overwhelming. I was inside their information network. Not metaphorically. My consciousness was literally interfaced with their data storage, experiencing their knowledge directly. I saw the Endless Prophet through Rak'gol perception, not as a ship, but as a collection of resources sorted by utility value. The crew wasn't people, but biological material with varying properties. The cargo was raw material. The vessel itself was infrastructure waiting to be optimized. I saw other ships, dozens of them, captured over years or decades, each one converted into specialized functions. Some were mobile laboratories like the Endless Prophet. Others were processing facilities, breaking down captured material into base components. A few were massive constructions, colony ships or factory vessels, built from the hulls of Imperial cruisers and modified beyond recognition. I saw their purpose, or as much of it as my human consciousness could process. The Rak'gol weren't raiders or pirates. They were survivors of some ancient catastrophe, refugees from a civilization that had been destroyed or abandoned them millennia ago. They scavenged because they had no production infrastructure of their own. They studied other species because they'd lost their own biological stability and needed to constantly adapt, using genetic material from whatever they encountered. They weren't evil. They were desperate. They took our ship not from malice, but from necessity. They cataloged us not for sadistic pleasure, but for survival. Every organ extracted, every specimen preserved, every piece of technology integrated. It was all part of a species-wide effort to maintain coherence in the face of slow extinction. Understanding their motives didn't make me forgive them. It made their actions more terrible, because I realized that from their perspective, They were being merciful. They kept Mediki Sarvan alive during her conversion because consciousness was precious, a resource not to be wasted. They preserved our names in their database because identity had value in their taxonomy. They'd even kept me intact, relatively undamaged, because my navigator genetics represented information they wanted to study further. We weren't victims. We were research material that happened to still be conscious. The connection lasted hours or days. I couldn't determine time while interfaced with their network. When they finally disconnected me, I collapsed on the platform and vomited, my human nervous system rejecting the overload of alien perception. A Rak'gol approached with the injector, administering the dulling substance, and I was grateful for it, despite knowing it was part of my conditioning. On the 7th day, they brought me to the bridge. The command center of the Endless Prophet was unrecognizable. The crew stations had been removed and replaced with organic control interfaces, grown from the deck like coral or bone, each one pulsing with bioluminescent patterns. The viewports remained, but the space beyond showed not the void I'd expected, but warp space. We were in transit, traveling through the immaterium without a Geller field, without the protections that kept human crews sane during warp passage. Captain Morton was there, or what remained of him. He'd been integrated with the ship's command systems, his body fused into the primary control interface, his nervous system directly connected to the Endless Prophet's cogitators and the Rak'gol navigation network. His eyes were open, aware, tracking my movement as I entered. His mouth could still form words, though the Vox amplification that carried his voice came from machinery rather than his own lungs. "Navigator Korm," he said, using his own voice this time, not Parth's hijacked vocal patterns. "They want you to understand the choice." I approached slowly. The bridge was occupied by 3 Rak'gol, each one attending to different control interfaces, monitoring readings I couldn't interpret. They ignored me, focused on their navigation tasks, trusting that I was no threat. "What choice?" I asked. "Integration or preservation," Captain Morton replied. "They've studied you enough to know you're valuable, but they haven't decided your function yet. If you accept integration, you'll be connected to their navigation network. Your human perspective on warp travel would complement their existing capabilities. You'd retain consciousness, retain some autonomy, but your body would be adapted to serve their needs. And preservation? They'll keep you in stasis, alive but frozen, a genetic sample for future study. When they need navigator genetics again, they'll extract what they require. Your consciousness would be suspended indefinitely. No dreams, no awareness, just biological storage until they decide you're needed." I looked at what they'd done to Captain Morton. His body was mostly gone, replaced with or subsumed into machinery, but his mind was clearly functional, his identity intact enough to remember who I was and communicate complex concepts. He was trapped, certainly, imprisoned in a way that made physical chains look humane. But he was still himself, still Captain Morton, still capable of thought and speech, and maybe even emotion. "How long have we been in transit?" I asked. 17 days, he replied. "We're following the route they planned, heading towards 77 Mark 23. There's a Rak'gol station there, a construct built from hundreds of captured ships. This vessel will be incorporated into the station's infrastructure. The crew, what remains of us, will be distributed according to utility. Those chosen for integration will continue serving. Those designated for preservation will be stored in the station's gene banks. And if I refuse both options, there is no third option. You've been studied. You've been evaluated. Your biology has value they need. The only question is whether you participate consciously or unconsciously. I turned to the viewports, looking out at warp space flowing past. Without my third eye, I couldn't perceive the immaterium's true nature. I saw only abstract colors and patterns, the visible light spectrum representation of something my mutated organ would have shown me in terrifying detail. The loss felt like amputation, a phantom sensation where warp sight should have been. What did you choose? I asked Captain Morton. Integration, because I wanted to remain conscious, because I believed that as long as I could think, I was still human, still myself, regardless of what they did to my body. He paused, and I heard something in his voice that might have been regret. I was wrong. I'm still conscious, but I'm not sure I'm human anymore. I perceive the ship differently now. I feel the Rak'gol navigation network as if it's part of my own nervous system. I understand their language, not by learning it, but by direct transmission of meaning. I'm becoming them. Slowly. Thought by thought. And the worst part is that I don't entirely mind. The Rak'gol at the control interfaces made vocalizations. Captain Morton responded in their language. Clicks and whistles that carried complex information I couldn't parse. Then he returned to Gothics. They need your decision within the hour. Choose integration, and you'll be prepared for surgical connection. Choose preservation, and you'll be transferred to the stasis chambers immediately. I looked around the transformed bridge at the organic interfaces and the Rak'gol attendants and the viewport showing warp space without terror. I thought about Medicae Sarvan, feeling her organs being replaced. About the crew members suspended in the cathedral, preserved as specimens. About my stolen navigator eye, floating in crystal solution, still alive, still functional, but severed from the consciousness that gave it meaning. I choose neither, I said. Captain Morton's expression didn't change. That option doesn't exist. Then they'll have to make it exist, I replied, because I won't cooperate with integration, and I won't accept preservation. They can force me, certainly. They can paralyze me and cut me open and do whatever they want. But I won't participate. I won't choose. They'll have to take responsibility for whatever they do to me. The Rak'gol stopped their work. All three turned to regard me, sensor organs focusing, processing my statement. Captain Morton vocalized in their language, longer this time, what sounded like explanation or translation. The Rak'gol responded with their own complex vocalizations. They're debating, Captain Morton said. Your refusal is unusual. Most captives either choose integration to maintain consciousness or accept preservation to escape awareness. Active resistance without violence is a response they haven't cataloged fully. The debate continued for what felt like 20 minutes. The Rak'gol made sounds, gestured with their appendages, consulted data on their organic interfaces. Finally, one of them approached me and made a vocalization that sounded almost like a question. Captain Morton translated. They're asking what you want instead. I want to be left alone, I said. Returned to my sanctum or given equivalent quarters. I want provisions and water. I want to remain aboard this ship, conscious and aware, but not integrated and not preserved. I want to be a witness. More vocalizations, more debate. Then Captain Morton spoke again. They're willing to accept a modified arrangement. You'll be given quarters in a section of the ship they're not using. You'll receive provisions. You'll be allowed limited freedom of movement. But you'll remain a captive, and at any time they can revoke the arrangement if they decide your value as a preserved specimen outweighs your value as an experimental control. Experimental control? They want to observe how an unintegrated human responds to long-term exposure to Rak'gol environment. Most of the crew either died in the initial assault, accepted integration, or were placed in preservation. You'll be the only conscious human aboard who remains completely separate from their systems. Your behavior, your mental deterioration or adaptation, your survival strategies, all of it will be data they don't currently possess. I was still an experiment, still a specimen, but I'd negotiated a form of imprisonment that let me remain myself, at least temporarily. I accepted. They gave me quarters in a section of Deck 4 that had been minimally modified. The corridor walls retained their metal plating, though veins of organic material ran along the ceiling. My chamber was a former storage compartment, 8 feet by 10 feet, containing a cot, a basic sanitation unit, and a small table with cogitator access. The cogitator was restricted. I couldn't control ship systems or access external communications, but I could read the logs, monitor our position, and most critically, continue recording my testimony. The Rak'gol either didn't care that I was documenting their actions or actively wanted me to document, treating my observations as part of their data collection. I lived aboard the transformed Endless Prophet for 63 days. During that time, I watched the ship arrive at the station Captain Morton had described, a massive construct built from countless captured vessels, fused together into a city-sized complex orbiting a dead world in the system designated 77 Mark 23. The Endless Prophet was incorporated into the station through a process that took 2 weeks. Docking ports were cut directly into the hull. The ship's systems were merged with the station's power grid. The cargo bays, including the cathedral, were connected to similar chambers in adjacent vessels. Our 43 crew members, those still alive, were distributed according to Rak'gol needs. Some were integrated into various ship systems. Others were transferred to the station's central gene banks for preservation. I remained aboard, now occupying quarters, in what had become a minor section of a much larger structure. The Rak'gol continued ignoring me, going about their tasks, maintaining their research, processing materials brought by other captured ships that arrived periodically. I had access to corridors in my section and was permitted to observe the cathedral on supervised visits. Mediki Sarvan died on day 42. Her human organs had been completely replaced by Rak'gol equivalents, and her body rejected the final integration. She remained conscious almost to the end, whispering the list of names one last time before her breathing stopped. The Rak'gol cataloged her failure, preserved her modified corpse for study, and continued their work without pause. Captain Morton remained at his station, integrated with the ship's command systems, conscious and aware. I visited him when permitted. He spoke less each time, his vocabulary shifting toward Rak'gol vocalizations, even when attempting Gothic. By day 60, he could barely remember his human name. But he still recognized me, still understood on some level that we'd served together, still retained fragmentary identity, even as the integration consumed his consciousness. The other crew members I couldn't visit. They were either in preservation, unconscious in stasis chambers, or had been integrated into systems I wasn't permitted to access. I knew they still existed somewhere in the station's vast network, cataloged and stored, and possibly still alive in some technical sense. But they were gone from human perspective, converted into Rak'gol resources. On day 63, a different ship arrived at the station, an Imperial vessel, smaller than the Endless Prophet, with signatures that identified it as an inquisitorial courier. The Rak'gol responded with unusual urgency, mobilizing forces, preparing defenses. The courier didn't engage. It transmitted a signal, a complex data burst that caused every Rak'gol in my section to stop their work simultaneously and focus on receiving the transmission. I accessed my cogitator and saw the message, untranslated but clearly structured. The Inquisition wasn't attacking. They were negotiating. The courier transmitted again, this time including visual data. Images of other Rak'gol stations, other captured ships, other human outposts on the edge of the halo stars. The message was clear. The Imperium knew the extent of Rak'gol activity, and they were offering something in exchange for cessation of raids on Imperial vessels. The negotiation lasted 6 hours. Then the courier departed, and the Rak'gol resumed their normal operations. I never learned the terms of whatever agreement was reached, but I noticed changes. New ships arriving at the station were not Imperial vessels, but Xenos craft, or pre-Imperium human hulks. Derelicts captured from neutral space rather than active shipping lanes. The Rak'gol had agreed to something. Perhaps a truce. Perhaps a boundary. Perhaps simply a commitment to raid outside Imperial territory. Whatever the terms, it meant the pressure on them had eased enough that they no longer needed to risk direct confrontation with inquisitorial forces. On day 87, they released me. Not from captivity, from observation. A Rak'gol entered my quarters and vocalized, and though I couldn't understand the language, the meaning was clear. My value as an experimental control had been exhausted. They'd collected all the data they could from watching an unintegrated human survive aboard their station. Now I was simply occupying space that had other potential uses. Captain Morton, barely recognizable as human anymore, translated the final message. You will be transferred to an Imperial vessel. A derelict freighter has been prepared with sufficient life support and supplies to reach the nearest inhabited system. You will not remember the station's coordinates. You will not remember the route used to reach this location. A memory suppression treatment will be administered before departure. I tried to refuse. The Rak'gol didn't negotiate. They administered the treatment, an injection that left me unconscious for an unknown duration. When I woke, I was aboard a strange ship, alone, with no memory of the journey from the station to wherever I'd been placed. The ship's cogitator contained only basic navigation data showing a route to Port Wander. But they'd made a mistake. The memory suppression treatment damaged my short-term recall, made it impossible for me to remember specific coordinates or routes. But I'd been recording my testimony continuously on my cogitator's shielded partition. The written account survived intact, bypassing the biological memory loss. I reached Port Wander 43 days later. I transmitted my testimony to the Administratum as required by law. I requested debriefing by inquisitorial authorities. I provided all technical data I'd collected about Rak'gol capabilities and intentions. The Administratum clerk filed my report in restricted archives. The Inquisition never contacted me. Port authorities processed me as a routine survivor, assigned me to a bulk hauler heading back toward Footfall, and sent me on my way with the standard trauma counseling stipend. The Imperium didn't want to know what I'd learned. They already knew. The inquisitorial courier's negotiation proved that. They'd been aware of Rak'gol activities, had been monitoring the stations, had reached some kind of accommodation. My testimony was just confirmation of information they already possessed, filed away in archives where it wouldn't disturb the comfortable fiction that the Imperium controlled the Halo stars. I never saw any of my crewmates again. The 43 names Mediki Sarvan recited are preserved in this recording, along with their fates as far as I witnessed them. Most are dead or integrated. Some remain in preservation, stored in gene banks aboard the station. biological samples waiting for future use. A few might even be conscious, scattered across the Rak'gol network, serving functions they never imagined during their human lives. Captain Morton is still there, still integrated with the Endless Prophet's command systems, still technically alive, still conscious, though increasingly alien in his thinking. When I last saw him, he said something I've tried to understand ever since. We were always just meat and electricity. They've proven it by changing the configuration. The only difference now is that we serve a different master, and this master at least doesn't pretend our suffering is for the Emperor's glory. I don't know if he believed that, or if the integration had progressed far enough that he'd adopted Rak'gol perspective as his own. I don't know if there's a difference. You asked what happens when Rak'gol turn your ship into a torture shrine. The answer is, they don't. Torture requires intent to cause suffering. Shrines require devotional purpose. The Rak'gol do neither. They convert captured vessels into functional spaces that serve their survival needs, using materials, biological and technological, according to utility rather than sadism. The suffering that occurs is incidental, a byproduct of the process, no more intentional than the pain a surgeon inflicts while operating. This makes it worse. If the Rak'gol were sadistic, we could understand them through familiar frameworks of evil and cruelty. We could categorize them as monsters and respond with appropriate violence. But they're not monsters. They're another intelligent species doing what every intelligent species does, using available resources to perpetuate their existence. We were the resources. The Endless Prophet was raw material. Our biology, our technology, our knowledge, all of it was inventory to be cataloged and utilized. The cathedral in Cargo Bay 2 wasn't torture, it was taxonomy. The integration of Captain Morton wasn't punishment, it was optimization. The preservation of our gene seed wasn't trophy collection, it was practical storage of valuable biological data. The Imperium teaches that humanity is the rightful inheritor of the galaxy, that all Xenos are obstacles to be eliminated or subjugated. But in the halo stars, far from Terra's light, the Rak'gol demonstrate an alternative perspective. Humanity is just another resource, and our ships are just another form of infrastructure waiting to be claimed and repurposed. 3 lessons remain from my time aboard the transformed Endless Prophet. First, intelligence does not require morality compatible with human understanding. The Rak'gol are sophisticated, organized, capable of complex reasoning and long-term planning. They negotiate with the Inquisition and honor agreements. They maintain detailed databases and conduct scientific research. They are not mindless predators. They simply operate according to ethical frameworks we have no capacity to accept. Second, survival strips away everything except necessity. The Rak'gol don't waste resources on cruelty because cruelty has no survival value. They keep captives conscious when consciousness serves their research. They integrate captives into systems when integration is efficient. They preserve genetic material when preservation is practical. Every action has clear purpose, even when that purpose causes horror. Third, the Imperium knows. The negotiation I witnessed wasn't first contact. It was continuation of an existing relationship, one conducted quietly by authorities who understand that some Xenos threats can't be eliminated and must instead be managed. The Inquisition has reached accommodation with the Rak'gol, trading them territory, or resources, or authorization to raid in specific regions in exchange for stability in others. My testimony was filed and forgotten because it confirmed information the Imperium already possessed and didn't want widely known. that human supremacy is propaganda, that imperial authority extends only as far as its guns can reach, and that, in the spaces between stars, other powers negotiate on equal terms. The 43 crew members of the Endless Prophet discovered this truth. Most paid with their lives or their humanity. A few still exist in states between life and death, serving purposes they never imagined. And one survivor remains free to testify, carrying knowledge that the Imperium would prefer stayed buried in restricted archives. This recording will reach you because I've learned to work outside Imperial channels. I've shared copies with sources across the expanse, people who understand that information has value beyond official sanction. Some of you will dismiss it as fabrication. Others will recognize the details as consistent with classified inquisitorial reports. A few will understand what it means that I'm still alive, still transmitting, still outside Imperial custody, despite theoretically being debriefed and processed. The Rak'gol released me intentionally. They had no reason to spare me except as data transmission, a witness who would carry their message back to Imperial space. The message is simple. Humanity's vessels are infrastructure. Humanity's biology is resources. Humanity's territory is negotiable. The Imperium can accept these terms and maintain nominal control over established trade routes. Or it can fight a species that doesn't fear death because it's already survived its own extinction. The Imperium chose acceptance. The treaty exists, unwritten and unacknowledged, enforced by inquisitorial operations that most Imperial citizens will never know about. Ships still disappear in the halo stars, but they're selected according to parameters that minimize political consequence. Rogue traders and pirates vanish. Unsanctioned prospectors are taken, but major merchant houses and military vessels receive protection, boundaries the Rak'gol respect, in exchange for continued access to their territories. This is what happens when your ship encounters Rak'gol. You become part of a system larger than any individual vessel or crew, part of negotiations conducted in shadows, part of truths the Imperium can't afford to acknowledge publicly. Death is not the worst outcome, because death ends awareness. The worst outcome is understanding, truly understanding, humanity's actual position in the galaxy. The Endless Prophet taught me that lesson. The 43 crew members whose names I preserve paid tuition in blood and suffering and loss of self. Their sacrifice bought this knowledge, bought this testimony, bought the warning I'm transmitting now. If you're hearing this, you're likely traveling routes where Rak'gol operate. Remember, your ship is infrastructure. Your biology is resources. Your survival depends on negotiated boundaries you were never informed about. The distress beacon from the Endless Prophet transmitted for 11 hours before salvage crews arrived. They found the vessel intact and empty, logged it as total loss, and moved on. Ask yourself, how many other ships have transmitted similar beacons? How many other survivors have filed testimony that vanished into restricted archives? How many other captives remain aboard Rak'gol stations, conscious or preserved, serving functions the Imperium knows about, but chooses not to rescue because maintaining the treaty matters more than individual lives? You already know the answer. You just didn't have confirmation until now. My name is Vasily Korm. I was junior navigator aboard the Endless Prophet. I survived because I refused both integration and preservation, because I demanded to remain conscious and separate, because I documented everything the Rak'gol permitted me to witness. This testimony exists because the Rak'gol allowed it to exist, because they wanted humanity to understand the terms of our negotiated coexistence.